The final touches were being placed on the floral arrangements inside the Meadowbrook Community Hall in Grove City, Ohio. A quiet hum of anticipation filling the air, unaware of the explosive secret about to be revealed. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn where a large white tent stood, ready to host the reception. It was August 12th, a seemingly ordinary Saturday transformed by hurried plans into James and Sarah's wedding day. The invitations, sent out just weeks prior, had cited an urgent but unspecified reason for the sudden timeline, accepted by guests with polite curiosity. Sarah's dress, a simple A-line gown, hung in a back room pristine and ready. James adjusted his tie in the reflection of a framed picture on the wall, his expression unreadable. The air, thick with the scent of roses and linen, held no hint of the coming violence. Family and friends began to arrive, filling the space with hushed greetings and the rustle of formal wear. Sarah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Miller, moved amongst the guests, their smiles fixed, perhaps masking anxieties known only to them. James's parents sat near the front, their attention fixed on the entrance. His brother, Michael, stood slightly apart, his gaze drifting towards the room where Sarah was preparing. The community hall, typically a venue for town meetings and bake sales, felt temporarily transformed, draped in white fabric and twinkling fairy lights. Every detail was meticulously arranged, a fragile facade of conventional celebration over a foundation of concealed truths. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 hours on p.m. At 2:45 p.m., the double doors opened, signaling the start of the procession. The organist began playing Pachelbel's canon and the bridesmaids, dressed in pale blue, walked slowly down the makeshift aisle. All eyes turned as Sarah appeared, escorted by her father. She looked radiant, her face serene, betraying nothing of the weight she carried. James watched her approach, his own face betraying little beyond the expected gravity of the moment. The vows were exchanged swiftly, the rings placed on fingers, the pronouncements made. James and Sarah Miller, husband and wife. The small congregation applauded politely. The sense of hurried formality lingered, a subtle current beneath the surface of the celebratory moment. Outside, the late afternoon sun warmed the tent, creating a gentle, inviting glow. Guests began migrating from the hall to the reception area, anticipating cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. The air inside the tent was lighter, filled with post-ceremony chatter and the clinking of glasses. Sarah and James shared a perfunctory first dance to a popular ballad, their movements stiff, lacking the easy intimacy one might expect. Witnesses later recalled their expressions, polite, distant, not unhappy perhaps, but certainly not ecstatic. The wedding cake, a two-tiered confection adorned with white frosting roses, sat untouched on a dedicated table. Platters of food were laid out buffet style. Children darted amongst the adults, their energy a stark contrast to the more subdued mood of their elders. Sarah spent time circulating, speaking with relatives, accepting congratulations with quiet grace. James remained closer to the head table, often seen in conversation with his parents, his brother Michael occasionally joining the periphery. The subject of the rushed wedding date surfaced in hushed tones amongst some guests, theories ranging from a sudden job relocation to simple impatience. None speculated on the reality. The temperature inside the tent began to rise slightly as the afternoon wore on. The band, hired for the evening, started playing softer background music. The planned toasts were next on the agenda. The best man, a friend of James, tapped a glass for attention. He offered generic well wishes, recounting harmless anecdotes from James's past. Then it was Michael's turn. As the groom's brother, his toast was anticipated. Michael stood, a microphone in hand, facing the seated guests and the wedding party. He cleared his throat. His smile seemed forced, slightly strained. He spoke briefly about growing up with James, sharing childhood memories. He then turned his attention to Sarah, offering a toast to her joining their family. His voice, however, wavered slightly. An almost imperceptible pause hung in the air before he delivered the line that would shatter the fragile peace of the day. He raised his glass, looking directly at Sarah, and with a strange mix of forced jocularity and underlying tension, made a comment that alluded specifically to her condition, and his unexpected connection to it. The precise wording was later disputed by shocked witnesses, but the intent was clear, the implication unmistakable. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The air in the tent became instantly still, the low hum of conversation ceasing entirely. All eyes turned towards James. His face, moments before a mask of polite composure, went stark white. His gaze locked onto his brother, then swung wildly towards Sarah. The smile vanished. His jaw tightened visibly. The revelation hung heavy in the silence, a poison released into the celebratory space. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. Michael stood frozen, the microphone still in his hand, his expression now one of dawning horror at the magnitude of his own words. The background music seemed to fade into nothing. The scent of roses suddenly felt cloying, suffocating. The quiet normalcy of the reception dissolved in an instant, replaced by a palpable sense of shock and disbelief. Whispers began to spread like wildfire through the seated guests. The secret, held so carefully beneath the surface of this rushed wedding, was now brutally exposed, not through quiet confession, but through a public, ill-timed and devastating announcement during what should have been a moment of shared joy. James pushed back his chair with a violent scrape that echoed in the sudden silence. The sound was sharp, jarring. He stood up, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes remained fixed on Michael, a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal replacing the earlier shock. The air crackled with tension. Sarah began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking. Her parents rushed to her side, confusion and distress etched on their faces. James took a step towards Michael. The best man instinctively moved to intervene, placing a hand on James's arm. But James shrugged him off with surprising force. The polite facade had crumbled completely. James's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and guttural, barely audible above the sound of Sarah's weeping. Yet it seemed to carry throughout the stunned assembly. He said only a few words, words later recalled with chilling clarity by those close enough to hear. He addressed Michael directly, his tone flat, devoid of emotion, but laced with immense anger. The subject was the pregnancy, the paternity, the ultimate deception. Michael dropped the microphone. It hit the ground with a dull thud, the sound amplified in the unnatural quiet. He stumbled back, his face ashen, mumbling apologies or explanations that were lost in the chaos beginning to erupt. Guests started to rise from their seats, unsure whether to flee, intervene, or simply watch the horror unfolding before them. A few people cried out. Sarah sobbed louder, leaning into her mother. James turned from Michael, his movements jerky and deliberate. His gaze swept over the crowd, landing on Sarah, then back towards the direction of the community hall building. He walked with a rapid, determined stride, pushing past tables and stunned onlookers. No one immediately tried to stop him. The path back to the hall seemed unnaturally long. Inside the main building, the rooms were mostly empty, quiet after the departure of the ceremony guests. He moved with a singular focus, heading towards a specific location he knew well. The back office, used for storage and administrative tasks, a place where certain items were kept. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The room was small, functional. File cabinets lined one wall, a desk the other. He moved quickly towards a locked metal cabinet in the corner. He had a key. The metal scraped as he inserted it and turned. He pulled the cabinet open. Inside, nestled amongst various supplies and equipment, was what he sought. A registered firearm, kept on the premises for security purposes, standard procedure for events with large crowds and potential cash transactions. He retrieved the weapon. It felt heavy and cold in his hand. The air in the small room felt tight, suffocating. He checked the magazine. Loaded. He closed the cabinet, the click echoing loudly in the silence of the office. He turned, his gaze fixed on the door leading back out towards the reception tent. His mind seemed to have narrowed to a single, devastating point of focus. The journey back through the hall seemed quicker this time, fueled by adrenaline and a cold, focused rage. He re-emerged from the building and stepped back onto the grass. The scene under the tent was one of frozen panic. People were standing, pointing, murmuring. Sarah was still near the head table, shielded slightly by her parents. Michael was off to the side, speaking rapidly to someone, gesticulating wildly. James raised the firearm. The sudden appearance of the weapon caused a new wave of screams and panic. People scrambled for cover, overturning chairs and tables in their haste. The music, which had been playing softly, cut out abruptly. The air filled with the sounds of terror, shouts, cries, the frantic shuffle of feet. James advanced towards the center of the tent, the firearm held steadily in his hand. His face was a mask of grim determination. He ignored the shouts, the pleas, the chaos swirling around him. His eyes remained locked on Sarah. He raised the weapon higher, aiming directly at her. Her father instinctively moved to shield her, but James was closer, and his movement was too swift, too final. 2 shots rang out. The sound was deafening under the confines of the tent, sharp cracks that ripped through the air. A collective shriek followed. Sarah crumpled to the ground. Her father recoiled, clutching his arm. Blood bloomed quickly on the front of Sarah's white dress, staining the pristine fabric a vivid, horrifying red. The wedding reception, moments before a scene of awkward revelation, had instantly transformed into a crime scene. Absolute pandemonium erupted. Guests screamed, diving under tables, scattering away from the center of the tent. James stood rooted to the spot for a moment, the firearm still held in his hand, smoke faintly visible near the muzzle. His eyes stared blankly at Sarah's fallen body. The silence that followed the gunshots felt absolute, broken only by the ragged breaths of terrified survivors and the growing sound of Sarah's mother's heartbroken wail. Sarah lay motionless on the grass, the white fabric of her wedding dress soaking up the dark stain expanding rapidly across her chest. Her father knelt beside her, pressing his hand to his arm, his face a mask of pain and horror. James slowly lowered the firearm. His hand seemed steady, his expression still vacant. Michael stood frozen at the edge of the chaos, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking. Within minutes, the first calls reached the Grove City Police Department. Dispatchers received multiple frantic reports. A shooting, a wedding, Meadowbrook Community Hall. Sirens could be heard approaching in the distance, growing louder with terrifying speed. First responders arrived within minutes. Police cruisers, fire trucks, and ambulance. The scene was immediately chaotic. Officers swarmed the tent, ordering remaining guests to show their hands, securing the perimeter. James offered no resistance. He was still standing near Sarah's body when officers reached him. He dropped the firearm when ordered, the metallic clatter on the ground adding another harsh sound to the scene. He was immediately handcuffed and escorted away from the tent, his movements robotic, his eyes still fixed on the ground. Paramedics rushed to Sarah's side, but their movements were swift and grim. There was little to be done. The 2 bullet wounds were immediately visible. The medical personnel worked briefly, but the futility was evident almost at once. Sarah was pronounced dead at the scene at approximately 4:17 p.m. Her body was covered with a white sheet, a stark, devastating mound on the blood-stained grass. The reception tent, moments before filled with fleeting festivity, was now a tableau of tragedy. Tables were overturned, glassware shattered, remnants of the planned celebration scattered amidst the signs of violence. Yellow crime tape began to go up, sealing off the area. Detectives arrived, their expressions grim and professional as they surveyed the scene. The lead investigator, Detective Sergeant Miller, no relation to the victim's family, began directing his team. Initial interviews were conducted with distraught witnesses, statements taken amidst tears and shock. The firearm was bagged and tagged as evidence. Shell casings were located and marked. Crime scene photographers documented every angle, every detail, preserving the devastating reality of the moment. The investigation into the death of Sarah Miller, née Jenkins, bride of just over an hour, had officially begun. The motive seemed immediately apparent to responding officers given the context of Michael's earlier announcement and the subsequent actions, but protocol demanded a thorough, meticulous investigation. James was transported to the Grove City Police Station for questioning. His brother, Michael, was also taken in for a formal interview, not as a suspect, but as a key witness whose public words had triggered the fatal events. Sarah's parents remained at the scene, comforted by officers, their grief raw and overwhelming. Their daughter, married just an hour ago, was gone. The wedding day, meant to be the happiest of their lives, had ended in unimaginable horror. The white sheet covering Sarah's body was a devastating focal point, a silent testament to the violence that had erupted so unexpectedly under the festive tent. The untouched wedding cake stood nearby, an eerie, pristine symbol of the future that would now never be. The community hall, which had hosted countless moments of local life, was now forever marked by this singular, brutal act. As the sun began to set, casting long, somber shadows, the scene remained active, floodlights brought in to allow investigators to continue their work into the night. Each piece of scattered debris, each overturned chair, held potential significance, part of the puzzle of the final fatal moments of Sarah Miller's life. The air grew cooler, but the tension remained thick, heavy with the weight of what had transpired. The investigation moved quickly from the chaotic scene to the controlled environment of the police station. James sat in an interview room, stark and sterile, facing Detective Sergeant Miller and another officer. His demeanor remained strangely detached, almost passive. He answered questions in a low monotone, providing details about the events leading up to the shooting. He recounted the wedding, the reception, his brother Michael's toast, and the revelation of Sarah's pregnancy and its paternity. His voice remained flat, devoid of the emotion that had propelled his actions moments before. He admitted to retrieving the firearm from the office, stating it was kept there and he had access. He admitted to walking back to the tent and shooting Sarah. When asked why, his response was chillingly simple. "She lied to me. They both did." He spoke of betrayal, of feeling humiliated and deceived on his wedding day. He offered no justification beyond the discovery itself. Michael was interviewed separately. She was visibly distraught, weeping intermittently throughout the process. He confirmed making the public announcement during his toast, explaining it was a misguided attempt at honesty, a way to get the secret into the open, though he claimed he never anticipated the violent reaction it would provoke. He confirmed his relationship with Sarah, and that the child was his. He spoke of a brief affair that had occurred months prior, during a difficult period in Sarah and James's relationship, and that they had tried to end it, but the pregnancy had resulted. He stated that Sarah had initially planned to tell James after the wedding, unsure how to break the news. The rush to marry, he explained, was Sarah's idea, a desperate attempt to secure her future before the pregnancy became obvious, hoping to somehow manage the truth later. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the narrative. The rushed wedding wasn't just for show. It was a calculated, if ultimately failed, strategy born of desperation. Back at the Meadowbrook Community Hall, the forensic team worked meticulously. They photographed the entry and exit wounds on Sarah's body before it was transported to the county morgue for an autopsy. Ballistics experts examined the firearm and the recovered shell casings, confirming the weapon recovered at the scene was the one that fired the fatal shots. Evidence markers dotted the grass under the tent, indicating the location of casings and other potential evidence. The path James took from the tent to the office and back was analyzed. Witnesses continued to provide statements, their accounts corroborating the sequence of events. Michael's shocking toast, James's furious reaction, his departure for the building, the sounds of the shots, the ensuing panic. The wedding guests, initially witnesses to a celebration, were now key sources for a murder investigation. The quiet community of Grove City was reeling. News of the shooting spread rapidly, disbelief and horror rippling through the town. A wedding day massacre was not something that happened here. The community hall, a symbol of local gathering, was now a stark reminder of the violence that had pierced its tranquility. The immediate aftermath was a blur of procedural actions, suspect processing, evidence collection, preliminary interviews, but beneath the surface of the official investigation lay the raw human tragedy. A bride dead on her wedding day, a groom facing murder charges, a brother implicated by his own words and actions, two families shattered by deception and violence. The swiftness of the events, from toast to tragedy in mere minutes, underscored the volatile mix of secrets, betrayal and rage that had ignited under the white tent. The police continued to gather evidence, building their case against James Miller. The firearm was identified as legally owned and registered to James, kept at the community hall for security as part of his volunteer role on the hall's managing committee. This detail explained his ready access to the weapon. Forensic analysis of the shell casings confirmed they were fired from that specific gun. The trajectory of the bullets was consistent with Sarah's injuries and James's position, as reported by witnesses. The autopsy report confirmed the cause of death as multiple gunshot wounds. The fact of Sarah's pregnancy was also confirmed, adding a medical layer to the established motive. The fetus was determined to be approximately 4 months along, consistent with the timeline of the affair Michael described. Investigators delved deeper into the relationships between James, Sarah, and Michael. Cow workers of Sarah described her as quiet and reserved, but seemed happy about the upcoming marriage, albeit surprised by the speed. Friends of James portrayed him as steady and reliable, not prone to outbursts, which made the violence all the more shocking to them. Michael's acquaintances saw him as more outgoing than James, sometimes impulsive. This background information helped contextualize the characters involved, highlighting the public personas that masked complicated private lives. Text messages and emails between Sarah and Michael were obtained through warrants. These communications confirmed the ongoing affair and their discussions about the pregnancy and how to handle it. Some messages revealed Sarah's increasing anxiety about revealing the truth to James. Others showed Michael struggling with guilt, but also a desire to be involved in the child's life. These private exchanges provided damning insight into the deception that had been maintained for months, adding weight to James's feeling of betrayal. There were also messages between James and Sarah, appearing superficially normal, discussing wedding plans, starkly contrasting with the secret communication between Sarah and Michael. This juxtaposition emphasized the depth of the deceit James perceived. The narrative began to solidify. Sarah, pregnant by James's brother Michael after an affair, rushes a wedding to James, hoping to conceal the truth only for Michael to expose the secret publicly, triggering James's violent reaction. The motive was clear: extreme emotional distress and rage triggered by the discovery of a profound double betrayal on his wedding day. However, the legal implications were complex. Was this premeditated murder, or a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment? The speed with which James acted after hearing the news would be a critical factor in the legal proceedings. His retrieval of the weapon from the office required deliberate action, leaving the immediate scene of the revelation and returning with the means to commit violence. This act of leaving and returning could be interpreted as a break in the heat of passion, suggesting intent. The community of Grove City began to process the shock. Vigils were held for Sarah. The Meadowbrook Community Hall became a focal point of grief and grim curiosity, surrounded by crime tape and eventually respectful silence. Flowers were left at the entrance. The untouched wedding cake was removed as evidence, a macabre artifact of the tragedy. The police investigation continued its methodical pace, gathering all necessary evidence for the prosecutor's office. James Miller was formally charged with murder. The charge would depend on the interpretation of the events: aggravated murder or a lesser degree of homicide, hinging on the element of premeditation or the definition of sudden passion. The prosecutor's office reviewed the evidence: forensic reports, witness statements, digital communications, James's own confession. The decision on the specific charge was crucial and would shape the entire legal battle ahead. The potential presence of sudden passion could be argued by the defense as a mitigating factor, reducing the charge from aggravated murder, which carries the possibility of the death penalty or life without parole in some jurisdictions, to voluntary manslaughter, a less severe offense. The prosecution would argue that the act of leaving the tent, retrieving the weapon, and returning introduced a sufficient lapse in time and deliberation to constitute premeditation, or at least move it beyond immediate heat of passion. The evidence package was compiled, a grim collection of documents detailing the final moments of a life and the destructive force of secrets. James was held without bond. His arraignment was scheduled. The legal fight was set to begin, dissecting the moments under the tent, seeking to define the nature of the rage that had led to such a devastating end. The focus shifted from the crime scene to the courtroom, where the narrative of August 12th would be debated. Piece by agonizing piece, the legal proceedings against James Miller commenced. He appeared in court, handcuffed and wearing a standard-issue jumpsuit, his face still showing little emotion. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty. The prosecution presented the initial evidence, outlining the events of the wedding day. The details were stark and clinical: the date, the location, the victim, the accused, the cause of death, the weapon, the motive. The public revelation of Sarah's pregnancy and its paternity was presented as the trigger. The defense hinted at the extraordinary circumstances, the profound betrayal James experienced, suggesting a state of mind that precluded premeditation. Bail was denied, deemed a flight risk and a danger to the community. James remained in custody. Pre-trial motions and hearings began. The defense sought to introduce evidence of Sarah's deception and Michael's role in it, as central to understanding James's state of mind. The prosecution aimed to focus on James's actions after the revelation: leaving the tent, obtaining the firearm, arguing these actions demonstrated intent and a lack of sudden passion as defined legally. Witness lists were prepared. Key witnesses would include Michael, Sarah's parents, and several guests who were close enough to hear Michael's toast and observe James's immediate reaction. Law enforcement officers involved in the initial response and investigation would also testify, detailing the crime scene, the evidence collected, and James's apprehension and statement. Forensic analysts would present findings on ballistics and the autopsy. The legal arguments centered on the definition of sudden passion and whether James's actions fit within that narrow legal window. The defense argued that the shock and emotional devastation of discovering such a profound betrayal, publicly and at his own wedding, was sufficient to negate premeditation. They would argue that his actions, while horrific, were a direct, albeit delayed reaction to an unbearable emotional blow. The prosecution countered that the time it took for James to walk to the office, unlock the cabinet, retrieve the gun, and return constituted a cooling-off period, however brief, that allowed for deliberation. They would emphasize the fact that he chose to arm himself and return to the tent with lethal intent. The trial date was set. The community watched closely. The tragedy still raw. Sarah's family prepared for the agonizing process of hearing the details of her death dissected in public. James's family was divided, grappling with the actions of one son and the involvement of another in the events leading to the death of the woman they had welcomed into their family. The legal system ground forward, seeking to apply complex statutes to a moment of intensely human, destructive emotion. The evidence included the recovered firearm, photographs of the crime scene, bloodstain patterns on the grass and Sarah's dress, the shell casings, and the door to the community hall office showing where James accessed the weapon. Digital evidence from Sarah and Michael's phones detailing their communications was also key. Michael's testimony was anticipated to be particularly difficult and crucial. He would have to recount his relationship with Sarah, the pregnancy, and the moment he made his ill-fated toast, knowing the devastating consequences. His emotional state, his credibility, and the specifics of his testimony would be heavily scrutinized by both the prosecution and the defense. Sarah's parents would offer victim impact testimony, describing the loss of their daughter, their grief compounding the public horror of the event. Their account of the wedding day, seeing their daughter walk down the aisle only to die an hour later, would be powerful and emotionally resonant. The defense would focus on James's character prior to the event, attempting to portray him as a man pushed to an extreme by extraordinary circumstances, rather than a cold-blooded killer. They might call character witnesses to testify about his reputation and relationships before the wedding day. The emotional atmosphere in the courtroom was thick, charged with grief, anger, and the clinical detachment of legal procedure. The trial promised to be a harrowing retelling of the day. Grove City's quiet normalcy was shattered. The legal battle over James Miller's fate unfolded in the Grove City courthouse. The prosecution presented its case first, methodically laying out the events of August. They called witnesses who had been present at the wedding, guests who described the initial festive atmosphere, the awkwardness during the toasts, the sudden silence after Michael's revelation, the moment James reacted, his departure, the sounds of the shots, and the ensuing panic. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of the chaos and horror. Detective Sergeant Miller testified, detailing the police response, the crime scene investigation, the evidence collected, including the firearm and shell casings. He described James's apprehension in his initial statement, focusing on James's admission of retrieving the gun and shooting Sarah. The forensic pathologist presented the autopsy findings, confirming the cause of death and the presence of the pregnancy. The ballistics expert explained how the recovered casings matched the recovered weapon. The digital forensics analyst presented the text messages and emails between Sarah and Michael, providing irrefutable evidence of their affair and their discussions about the pregnancy and the planned rushed wedding. Michael Miller took the stand. His testimony was emotionally charged. He recounted the affair, the pregnancy, his guilt, and his decision to make the public announcement, claiming he believed the truth needed to come out, albeit in a deeply misguided manner. He described James's immediate reaction with visible distress. Under cross-examination by the defense, he was pressed on the timing of the affair, the depth of the deception, and Sarah's intentions regarding telling James. The defense sought to emphasize the extreme provocation of the circumstances. Sarah's parents testified, their grief palpable, recounting the joy they felt walking their daughter down the aisle just an hour before she died. Their testimony humanized the victim and underscored the devastation wrought by the crime. The prosecution rested its case, having presented a compelling narrative, supported by forensic evidence, witness accounts, and the defendant's own statements. The defense then presented its case, focusing heavily on James's state of mind at the moment of the shooting. They argued that the sudden public revelation of his wife's pregnancy by his own brother, occurring at his wedding, constituted extreme provocation that triggered a response born of sudden passion rather than premeditation. They called a psychologist to testify about the potential psychological impact of such a profound betrayal and public humiliation, arguing it could induce a dissociative or highly emotional state, where rational thought is suspended. James Miller chose to testify in his own defense. He recounted the day from his perspective, describing his feelings of shock, confusion, and overwhelming betrayal when he heard Michael's words. He described his decision to retrieve the gun as an impulsive, almost automatic reaction fueled by intense anger and hurt. He stated that in that moment, he felt his entire life, his future with Sarah, was a lie. He expressed remorse for his actions, but maintained that he wasn't thinking clearly when he fired the shots. Under cross-examination, the prosecutor challenged his claim of sudden passion, highlighting the time elapsed between the revelation, leaving the tent, retrieving the gun, and returning. They pressed him on the deliberate steps involved in obtaining the weapon, arguing this demonstrated a capacity for thought and intent. The prosecutor played excerpts of James's initial police interview where he calmly described his actions, contrasting it with his courtroom testimony portraying himself as consumed by emotion. Closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution argued for a conviction of aggravated murder, emphasizing the deliberate act of retrieving the firearm and returning to the scene. They argued that betrayal, however painful, did not legally justify murder, and that James had ample opportunity to pause and reconsider his actions. The defense argued for a lesser charge, such as voluntary manslaughter based on the theory of sudden passion caused by extreme provocation. They reminded the jury of the extraordinary circumstances of the betrayal and its public nature, arguing it would cause any reasonable person to lose control. The jury deliberated for several days. The tension in the courtroom was immense as the hours passed. The verdict was finally reached. James Miller was found guilty of murder, the specific degree likely reflecting a finding that it was not purely sudden passion, as defined legally, and the associated sentence were announced. The court's decision brought a formal legal conclusion to the case, but offered little solace to the shattered families involved. The final judgment was rendered. James Miller was sentenced to a substantial prison term, the specific duration reflecting the severity of the crime as determined by the court and jury, balanced against any mitigating factors considered. The sentence marked the end of the formal legal process, but the consequences of the wedding day tragedy continued to ripple outwards. Sarah Miller was buried shortly after the events of August 12th. Her grave became a focal point for her grieving parents and remaining family, a quiet, somber place contrasting starkly with the violent end to her life. The fact of her pregnancy was often mentioned in hushed tones, adding another layer of sadness to her untimely death. Not only was a young woman gone, but also a life that had not yet begun. Michael Miller faced no criminal charges in Sarah's death, his role limited to the act of revealing the secret, however catastrophic the consequence. However, he carried the heavy burden of knowing his words triggered the violence, and that he was the father of the child Sarah was carrying. His relationship with his own parents and the wider community was irrevocably altered, marked by shame and grief. He withdrew from public life, grappling with the devastating aftermath of his actions. James began serving his sentence. His life, defined for one brief hour by marriage, was now defined by incarceration. The quiet, steady man known by friends and family was now a convicted murderer. His future, once intertwined with Sarah's, was now a stark, confined existence within prison walls. The wedding photos, intended to capture the beginning of a life together, instead documented the moments leading up to its violent end, never to be displayed, locked away as painful reminders. The Meadowbrook Community Hall eventually reopened, but the memory of the shooting lingered. For a long time, the white tent was not used for events, its presence a reminder of the scene of the crime. The community grappled with the horror that had occurred in their midst, the understanding that such violence could erupt from seemingly normal lives. The untouched wedding cake, examined as evidence, was a silent witness to the planned future that evaporated in gun smoke. It represented the hopes and expectations that were brutally extinguished, a potent symbol of the devastating loss. The specific details of the case, the wedding setting, the brothers' involvement, the public nature of the revelation, made it a story that captured grim public attention, a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets and betrayal. But beyond the sensational headlines and the legal outcome, lay the profound, quiet devastation left in its wake. Lives were shattered, The victims extinguished, the perpetrators confined, the families of all involved left to navigate a landscape of grief, guilt, and irreparable loss. The celebration of love became a tableau of death, a stark reminder that even in moments of supposed joy, hidden truths can erupt with horrifying force, leaving behind only silence and the lingering question of how something so normal could end so grimly. The quiet streets of Grove City, Ohio held the memory of that day, a permanent scar on the fabric of the community, a testament to the human cost of secrets kept and violently revealed.